All right. So heat illness in the past has typically only applied to the outdoor workplace, at least from a standard standpoint. So we have seen Cal OSHA implement a heat illness prevention plan standard in recent years, and they are in the final stages of implementing a standard for the indoor workplace. So we're going to be talking about both what you can expect from the indoor standard that will be coming. It does mirror the outdoor workplace standard pretty closely, but there are some key differences that we'll make sure we discuss. So even though they haven't implemented the standard yet, I also recommend that as a best practice, employers that do have indoor operations that may have elevated temperatures implement some of these best practices anyways. So all employers are subject to the 1970 OSH Act General Duty Clause, which essentially states that an employer has to provide a work environment that's free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So when we break this down, it's saying that even if OSHA hasn't written a standard on a certain work practice or hazard, if the employer knows that it's a hazard to their employees, then they have to implement a plan and controls anyways in order to protect their employees. So the two topics we're talking about with indoor and outdoor, these are going to apply to all outdoor workplaces. And the new standards are going to apply to indoor workplaces that exceed 82 degrees when employees are present. Now, many of you have seen these posters, especially up in outdoor places. They're there as reminders to let our workers know that they need to be protecting themselves, that there are dangers with the heat. And we're going to be talking about that stuff today. So in this session, we're going to discuss the physiology of heat stress, what's happening within the body, what happens to our workers, how that's a hazard to them. We'll also discuss certain risk factors that may cause somebody to be at more risk of experiencing a heat illness situation. We'll discuss the provisions of water, access to shade and cool down areas. We'll talk about different heat-related illnesses and the symptoms that you'll encounter in those so you can better recognize when an employee may be having a heat illness. We'll discuss engineering controls and work practices, as well as training and preventative measures. So what happens when we're exposed to heat? Well, first of all, the body needs to relieve that excess heat to maintain a stable internal temperature. And it does this by circulating the blood to the skin and through sweating. Cooling the body comes more complicated when the air temperature is close to or warmer than our normal body temperature. Sweating is effective only if humidity levels are low enough to allow evaporation, and if the fluids and salts we lose through sweating are inadequately replaced. So the body's trying to cool itself down by activating its cooling mechanism of generating sweat. But unfortunately, we're losing fluids and salt, which is important with hydration in that process. So how is this a hazard to our workers? The body will store heat if it can't get rid of the excess heat. So there are certain risk factors that will cause somebody to not be able to rid itself of heat. Sometimes certain clothing that they're wearing, the environment that they're in, if it's humid outside and the sweat can't evaporate from the body, which will cause their core temperature and their heart rate to rise. When this happens, we have a loss of concentration, for one. An employee will have difficulty focusing. They may become irritable. They could feel sick, lose the desire to drink the fluids that are necessary to replenish what they've lost. If the body is not cooled down, then fainting can happen. We call that heat syncope. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. Or you can experience death when we get into heat stroke situations. Many of you, if you're in San Diego County, may have heard that there was a hiker on Black Mountain this weekend that went missing. And I just heard word this morning that they did find her, but she had passed away from heat stroke. So it was a very hot weekend. If there was insufficient water or certain risk factors for her, that could have caused her to find herself in that scenario and be in a place where she couldn't get what she needed to replenish those fluids. When you have excessive exposure, it can cause a range of heat illnesses, including heat stroke, like we just talked about, which requires immediate medical attention. And we'll talk about the reasons why a little bit later. That exposure to heat can also increase the severity of injuries due to sweaty palms, fogged up safety glasses, dizziness, and/or burns. So the heat exposure can actually create other hazards or make other hazards worse because of the situation that the employee is in. So who can be affected? Well, a large range of employees, workers that are in a hot indoor environment, workers that are exposed to hot and humid indoor conditions, those exposed to hot outdoor conditions, and those exposed to hot and humid outdoor conditions. So some of the risk factors, these are things that can cause somebody to be at a higher risk of experiencing a heat illness. So first of all is environmental factors. So there may be some job-specific factors like high temperature or humidity, environments where a job takes a lot of physical exertion, cases where there's a radiant heat source nearby, if breaks aren't taken frequently enough, contact with hot objects, back-to-back days in the heat performing strenuous tasks, direct sun exposure where there is no shade. These ones would be a part of the activities as well. So direct sun exposure where there is no shade, when employees are pushed to continue working through the discomfort of heat strain, and then when there's limited air movement, so we have a lack of a breeze, wind, or proper ventilation. Other risk factors could be an employee not being acclimated to their environment or medications that they take. Getting acclimated takes about 4 to 14 days, depending on the individual. And when we have what may be a new employee or an employee that is transferred from a different climate to ours, that climate, even if it doesn't seem hot to us, may be hot to them. And we want to make sure we give them the proper time to get adjusted to the new climate. And so we can maybe limit their work hours over the first couple weeks, at least their hours that they're exposed to the heat, and generally get them acclimated with the new temperature. There are also certain lifestyle factors. Make sure we encourage frequent breaks, so slowly build tolerance. If they're taking prescription medications, some of them can cause heat intolerance. So acclimating with medications is important as well. So certain medications like blood pressure medications, blood thinners, antihistamines, decongestants, other types of stimulants or psychiatric medications can increase somebody's risk. So keep in mind, not all employees are the same, and we have to look out for these different risk factors in each individual. Dehydration or health conditions. So dehydration is one of the most critical factors. We want to make sure that we're not waiting until we feel thirsty to drink water. If you're waiting until you feel thirsty, then it's probably too late. Drinking alcohol the night before will cause you to be at a higher risk factor for dehydration. Limited caffeine or energy drinks. They also dehydrate you. They're called diuretics. The caffeine actually causes you to be more dehydrated than if you were drinking water. Heavy sweating that removes the salt and minerals from the body that needs to be replaced. Sometimes you can use a sports drink or a hydration salt packet in these situations to help with the absorbing of the water. And then certain health conditions. So some short-term illnesses like diarrhea, vomiting, or respiratory infections can increase the risk. Some chronic conditions like diabetes or heart disease. And then also people that have poor physical fitness or that have issues with being overweight or obese are actually at a higher risk as well. Other factors, including prior heat illness. So if you've experienced a heat illness before, then you're more likely to experience a heat illness again. So severe heat illness may cause a permanent acute damage to the heart, to the kidneys, to the liver, which may lead to chronic and even fatal disorders. Some additional factors could be workers that are over the age of 60, or when they're wearing non-breathable clothing or personal protective equipment. All right, so provisions of drinking water. So according to OSHA, water has to be provided at no cost to the employee and must be fresh, pure, and suitably cool. The employer must take precautions to prevent contamination to the drinking water. The water must be located as close as practicable to the areas where employees are working and in indoor cool down areas. We'll talk about cool down areas a little bit later, but it's similar to access to shade according to the outdoor standard. Where you have drinking water that's not plumbed or otherwise continuously supplied, it has to be provided in sufficient quantity at the beginning of the work shift to provide 1 quart per employee per hour for drinking throughout the entire shift. So you got to do the math of how long your employees are going to be working, how many employees you have, and then make sure you have 1 quart per hour per employee for that entire shift readily available. You may start a shift with a smaller quantity of water available as long as you have effective procedures in place for replenishment during the shift as needed to provide employees with that 1 quart per hour. And then you also have to make sure that you encourage your employees to drink water frequently. Access to water, so portable containers. As you can see, this picture is really old. It's from 2001. This used to be an old practice, and it's not really done too much anymore, especially after COVID. Employers have gone to strictly providing bottled water, so that way there is no confusion or contamination potentials there. But if we are going to be using portable containers to dispense the drinking water, then they have to be capable of being tightly closed and equipped with a tap. The water should not be dipped from containers. Also, any container used to distribute drinking water needs to be clearly marked as to the nature of its content and not used for any other purpose. All right, so access to shade or cool down areas. So when we're working in an outdoor environment and we see temperatures below 80, we don't need to have shade out and available, but it needs to be readily available at all times. So if we have a pop-up like in this picture that we know we can put out if the employees request it, or if the temperature rises and we're getting to above 80 degrees, then we have access readily available to put that in place. Now, once we have the temperature above 80, then an employer has to maintain at least 1 or more elements of shade at all times. That shade has to be, access to the shade has to be permitted at all times. The area must not cause exposure to another health and safety hazard. And you want to try to locate that shade as close as possible to the area where employees are working. Be sure to provide enough shade to accommodate the number of employees on recovery or rest periods and during meal periods. You want to allow and encourage employees to take cool down rests in the shade, and such access should be available at all times. So if an employee says, hey, I'm kind of feeling a little hot and I want to go take a little micro break in the shade, then by all means, go ahead and do that. That should be the answer by the employer. Make sure that we're monitoring employees that were on cool down rest so we can look for the development of signs and symptoms of heat illness so we can take action early. If they are experiencing symptoms, make sure you don't return them to work until the symptoms are abated. We want to allow at least a 5-minute rest when they request it. And if you do experience heat illness symptoms, then we want to take the proper first aid steps. And we're going to talk about those with the signs and symptoms of each type of heat illness in a little bit. So for the indoor industry, we have to maintain what is called a cool down area. And that's when the temperature is above 82 degrees. And we'll talk about some of those as well. All right, so high heat procedures for outdoor workplaces. So this is when the temperature equals or exceeds 95 degrees. An employer has to implement additional precautions like communication. We have to ensure that there's an effective way to communicate with our team, whether it's through voice, observations, cell phones, radios. We have to have an emergency response procedure put in place. So that may be, who's being designated to call 911. Do we have a location where that rescue crew is going to arrive and we can send a flagger out to let them know where on a job site or where in a work area the injured employee is, and what the EAP procedures will be for the team. And also conduct proper observation of the employees while they're working in high heat situations. You want to make sure that you're reminding employees to drink water. You have to designate one supervisor for 20 or fewer employees. When we get to these temperatures, also pre-shift meetings become mandatory. You should have a buddy system put in place so that way crews are looking out for each other while they're out there. Now, if you're working in the agriculture industry, once temperature exceeds 95, then employees have to take a mandatory 10-minute cool down rest every 2 hours. And if you're in that industry and in those temperatures, I also recommend recording that those breaks are being taken, just in the event that there's an audit and they want to confirm that the breaks are being conducted per the standard. High heat procedures for indoor workplaces. So these 4 bullets are temperature thresholds to where the high heat procedures would become active if you're experiencing these. So the temperature equals or exceeds 87 when employees are present, or the heat index equals or exceeds 87 when employees are present. Or if the employees are wearing clothing that restricts heat removal and the temperature equals or exceeds 82. Or when employees work in a high radiant heat area and the temperature equals or exceeds 82. So if you have any of these 4 situations, employers have to assess the workplace heat by taking and maintaining accurate records of the temperature and the heat index of areas where employees work, and at times when employees' exposure is expected to be the greatest. Make sure these records include the date, time, and location of the reading. You want to make sure you take an initial measurement when reasonable to suspect the above scenarios, or when reasonably expected to be 10 degrees higher than previous measurements. Employers will have to maintain the records for 12 months or when the next measurements are taken, whichever is longer. They're also going to need to identify and evaluate other risk factors for heat illness. So having an effective procedure to include employees and union reps in the planning, conducting, and recording measurements of temperature and heat index, and identifying and evaluating other environmental risk factors. This is a link to an app that's from OSHA, that is their heat index app. So it helps you calculate what the heat index is based off of the temperature and the humidity levels. And then that'll give you a better idea of what the heat index is. So it's a good tool. There's some other resources in there as far as symptoms and first aid procedures. So I recommend that everyone download this app and just have it in their phone, and they can use it as a tool. All right, so heat-related illnesses. You can experience heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat rash, or what we call prickly heat, heat syncope, and heat stroke. Now, these are definitely in order of severity, heat cramps being the more common and less severe heat illness, and then heat stroke being life-threatening. But it's not necessarily in the order that they need to present themselves. You know, I don't have to have an employee experience heat cramps in order to experience heat exhaustion. And in some cases, you could see somebody progress rapidly into a heat stroke situation, and the signs and symptoms of previous heat illness are no longer there. So, you know, we don't want to assume that, oh, we didn't see signs of heat cramps, so this can't be heat stroke. So when an employee experiences heat cramps, they can occur either during or after the working hours. These are muscle cramps and spasms or pain that occur in the abdomen, in the arms, and the legs. It's caused from low salt levels inside the muscles. And they can also be from tired muscles, so those that are used for performing work that are usually the ones most affected by cramps. So in the event that an employee is experiencing heat cramps, you want to have the employee rest in a shady, cool area. Encourage drinking fluids every 15 to 20 minutes and eating a small snack or even having a sports drink. So what you're trying to do is replenish some of that sodium. We recommend avoiding the salt tablets. The body doesn't absorb those in the same way when it comes to rehydration as it will a sports drink or getting sodium from that snack. But what's happening there is the process of osmosis, your cells absorbing fluid is run by the presence of salt. When you have salt in your system, it helps drive the water into your cells. When we have low sodium levels outside of our cells, then you can actually have the water, what reverse osmosis can occur in the water, gets expelled from the cells and the cells become shriveled. And that's when you'll lead into situations with heat cramps. So the food is a vital part in this stage of getting them the help that they need. Make sure that you seek additional medical help if the employee has heart problems, is on a low sodium diet, or if the cramps do not subside within an hour. So the next we're going to talk about is heat exhaustion. This is a more progressive level of heat illness from beyond heat cramps. Symptoms usually include headaches, possible nausea or vomiting, dizziness or lightheadedness, a decreased urine output, irritability and thirst, excessive sweating. This is a key to being able to identify between heat exhaustion and heat stroke is the presence of excessive sweating. A elevated heart rate, elevated body temperature, or just general weakness. So for those signs and symptoms with heat exhaustion, make sure we call for medical help or take the worker to a health facility for evaluation and treatment. Remove the employee from that hot area and stay with them until help arrives. We want to encourage them to drink water, but only sip on it gradually. We don't want them to drink a lot of water at once. If they are experiencing nausea and vomiting, them drinking a lot of water at once or even having food at this stage, you don't want to give them food here either, could encourage them to vomit again. And then they're going to expel even more fluids. So we can make them worse off than what they were before as far as their hydration levels when we have them drink too much water or give them food. You can attempt to cool down the employee with cool compresses, water, or an ice bath or fans, and try to remove unnecessary clothing like shoes and socks, gloves, headgear. Our body expels some of that excess heat through our extremities, and the body will be able to cool down quicker if we remove those items. So next is heat rash, or we also call it prickly heat. It's one of the more common problems that we see in hot work environments. What it is skin irritation that's caused by the sweat that doesn't evaporate from the skin. So what we see is in those hot environments, the pores in our skin dilate, and then the salt from the sweat gets inside those pores and it causes a rash. So it'll usually present with red clusters of pimples or small blisters that are usually seen on the neck, upper chest, groin, upper breast, and in elbow creases. Extensive area of skin that does not sweat on heat exposure but presents a goose flesh appearance and is alleviated with cool environments. So once we get the employee into a dry situation, we can better manage the heat stress or the prickly heat. Oftentimes it may be caused from sweating in a shirt that we were wearing, and the shirt stays wet, and then our body stays wet, and then we end up having that rash develop. So the best treatments, when possible, is to get them into a cooler, less humid environment to keep that rash area dry. You can use powders in some instances to increase comfort, like a Gold Bond or something like that absorbs moisture. You don't want to use ointments or creams, as those impair cooling. And then a warm, moist skin equals a worse rash. One of the recommendations that I have for this is, if the employee gets home, what they should do is, take a shower normally with warm or hot water, which is going to cause their pores to dilate and open up, and wash the salt out that had gotten in there from the excessive sweating during the day. And then at the end of the shower, turn it on to cold. And the body's reaction to the cold is going to cause their pores to constrict and close up after we've washed out the salt. And that will actually enable them to rid of the rash a lot sooner. So heat syncope, this is where there may be an episode of dizziness or fainting, which usually occur when a worker stands for a prolonged period or gets up from a sitting or lying position. Workers that are dehydrated or not yet fully acclimated to the environment can also experience this. So what do? We want to have them sit or lie down in a cool place as soon as possible. Once you know that they're feeling faint or dizzy, and then have them slowly drink water or sports drink or something. Typically, heat syncope will alleviate itself as the employee gets water into their system and their body cools down a little bit. All right, so heat stroke. This one is the life-threatening emergency, and immediate action is required. All right, so this is where there's no time to play around. We want to get them emergency help as soon as we can. So heat stroke happens when the body can't regulate its core temperature and can no longer rid itself of excess heat. With heat stroke, the body's temperature rises rapidly, and the body's ability to sweat fails and cannot cool down. So what we see is, maybe a worker that, has not replenished their water properly, or they've been sweating so much that they're so dehydrated that now they don't have the fluids to sweat. And that mechanism to cool themselves down breaks down and is no longer effective. So when we see this, sometimes employees will have a body temperature of 106 or higher, and it can happen really fast. Temperatures can climb within 10 to 15 minutes. These situations can cause death or permanent disability if emergency treatment is not provided. So some of the other signs and symptoms you'll see will be confusion or an altered mental state, or the employee could just be unconscious. So if an employee is not aware of who they are, where they are, events leading up to the situation that they're in, that would be an altered mental state. Or if they're unconscious, obviously, we want to make sure that we're calling 911 for those situations. We can see seizures present in this level of heat illness. The employee will have hot, dry skin. They could still potentially have heavy sweating, but in most cases it's not. You won't see sweating too much because the fluids aren't there to do it. But you will see profuse sweating in heat exhaustion levels. And then also very high body temperatures. So what do we do in this situation? Well, first off, call 911 immediately. Implement your emergency action plan. Make sure that we're guiding rescuers in to where the employee is. Try to move them to a cool area and remove outer clothing. Cool the worker. We can do this by using cold packs. We don't want to use real ice in this situation because that can cool the worker too fast and actually put them into shock. But those chemical packs that come in first aid kits that you break, those are perfect for this situation. You can put them on their neck, into their armpits, underneath their knees to help cool the employee down. And make sure that we're staying with them until the medical services arrive. All right, so next we're going to talk about engineering controls as well as some administrative controls and work practices. So currently the outdoor workplace doesn't have a standard for engineering controls. OSHA doesn't address it, as many of them are unfeasible. We don't really have the ability to put in air conditioning or mechanical ventilation isn't going to work. You could possibly try some cooling fans or misters in really hot areas to help cool employees down. But there isn't an actual section on engineering controls in the standard. But the indoor workplace, the new standard that's coming out, does address engineering controls. When it essentially says that the engineering controls have to be implemented to reduce and maintain both the temperature and the heat index to below 87 degrees when employees are present, or to reduce the temperature to below 82 degrees when employees wear clothing that restrict heat removal or they work in high radiant heat areas, except to the extent that the employer demonstrates such controls are infeasible. When such controls are infeasible to meet the temperature and heat index thresholds, the employer must use engineering controls to we'll get into, they use administrative controls if the engineering controls are not feasible. So excuse me, what this is saying is that if we cannot reduce it to 87 with engineering controls, then you must use engineering controls to reduce it to the lowest feasible temperature prior to going to administrative controls. Excuse me, I missed up on that part. So in the event that engineering controls aren't feasible and we're using them to decrease it to the lowest possible temperature, we can also implement administrative controls. So administrative controls are more of like best work practices or standards that we put into place as far as how employees conduct their work, or how we schedule our work. Now, the outdoor standard, again, does not address this specifically, but we should be using some of these as a best practice for our outdoor workers. And the indoor standard does address administrative controls. So when your engineering controls are infeasible, then you need to implement administrative controls. And those could be, incorporating work and rest cycles, so we're scheduling our employees to take extra breaks when we know that they're exposed to heat, or we're going to trade employees out. So that way we're not exposing the same employees to that hazard throughout the day. If we know that we're going to have heavier, more strenuous work, then we want to schedule those during cooler times of the day. And that can help with the exposure to the heat. In addition to administrative controls, when we find that those are infeasible, then the employer will need to implement personal heat protective equipment for indoor workplaces. All right, so our work practices for both indoor and outdoor employers are going to need to implement a written heat illness prevention plan. I have a sample plan that I will post along with this video that you can refer to, or take and modify to fit your operations. You also want to make sure that you have an emergency plan in place that's outlining what to do when an employee shows symptoms, especially those symptoms of heat stroke. Make sure your employees are acclimated. We talked about earlier, 4 to 14 days. We want to give the employee that time, limit their exposure to the heat so the body can properly adjust to a new climate. Make sure you're providing that potable water close to the work area, and then be aware and look out for one another, set up buddy systems, and make sure employees are reporting symptoms right away. We also have to make sure that we provide training to our employees. So the training has to include a lot of the things that we've talked about today, the risk factors for heat illnesses, understanding the differences, the different types of heat-related illnesses, including how to recognize signs and symptoms, heat-related illness prevention procedures, the importance of drinking small amounts of water and how often they should be, the importance of getting acclimated, and how your worksite procedures address that. Training on why it's important to report signs and symptoms to your safety managers or supervisors, procedures to follow when emergency services need to be contacted, and then training on the procedures that are in place to provide emergency services with clear and precise directions to the worksite and to the victim. So if you're going to be implementing a training program for your teams, then these elements must be covered in the training. And then just talking about employers' responsibilities and workers' rights a little bit, the worker has a right to a safe workplace that's free of known hazards. That's the general duty clause that we talked about at the beginning of our session. OSHA requires employers to provide their employees with that safe and healthful workplace, and then employees have a right to raise a safety concern or report an injury to OSHA without fear of reprisal from the employer. And then that's what I have on heat illness this morning. Is there any questions that have come up throughout the slides here?
Yeah, actually just one question. So you did a great job. I found it to be very informative myself. Basically, the question was whether or not you were going to be providing the slide deck or copies of the slide deck. I believe the answer to that is that yes, we are. They'll be posted on the website, and I believe we're also going to be sending that out to all of the attendees via email, probably as an attachment. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Outside of that, there were no other questions today, so you covered things very well. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and hope that you found it informative. Again, you can get this information on our website. It'll be posted within the next few days, the recording as well as the actual slide deck. And I don't know if there's anything else that you wanna say, Drew.
Just that, we are seeing the warmer temperatures now. And this is the time to be doing your employee training if you haven't already. I always advise, right before the temperatures start to increase that we get the training done then. And if you're looking at getting something going with that and you have questions or need assistance, feel free to reach out to us here, or to reach out to myself and I can help answer questions. Or take a look at what you're going to be looking at providing as far as your training and give any feedback that you might need. So we're always here as a resource for you.
Fantastic. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And when is our next safety topic? Drew, do you recall which that won't be next month, but the month after, I believe.
I believe so. Yeah, we'll put out an announcement when we have something more solid.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thanks again to everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.